All right, hello, welcome. This is Unbearble Lightness of Being, chapter, like lecture 6. We're going to talk about the Grand March, and we're going to finish off the book. It's Christmas, there's a lot of people at the house. Somebody might come in and interrupt. Also, it's taking forever to find a quiet place. What's a man got to do around here, right? Anyway, let's talk about, does it matter, right? Can anyone be happy? And is this a depressing book as we finish off this book? So we're going to start with part 6, which is the Grand March. It talks about this, Stalin's son dying in a concentration camp or prisoner camp, and how it was over shit, right? The idea of like this, like shit is a big theological problem, even like pleasure, right? That other side of life, that kind of animalistic side, you could almost say, starts off with that kind of frames this chapter. And then he gets into the notion of kitsch, which is like a two-part awe, I guess I would say. It's like to say like oh to like an obvious situation, and it's like to join the multitudes in doing this, right? But even the process of mocking this, he points out, is a little bit cliche, right? You're still one of the crowd if you find a reason to mock it. So, what is the conservative version of kitsch? He talks about this American senator, the grass, the lawn, the kids playing on the playground. Like, isn't this happiness? Like that kind of notion of kitsch. Now, what is the left? What's the left's version of kitsch? And that's more this like the Grand March, right? Which is this notion that like what you're doing really is like good and valuable and like really matters. I have a book, White Man's Burden, that's around here somewhere, right? And it's about like NGOs and trying to help out and do good. Like, what's that all about? Like, are you actually doing anything, or are you just patting yourself on the back? So let's take a look at this whole section on Cambodia, which is like hilariously satirical or like really depressing. It depends on how you look at it. Right, the idea was for a group of important Western intellectuals to march to the Cambodian border, and by means of this great spectacle performed before the eyes of the world, to force the occupied country to allow the doctors in. Right, it's grand spectacle, like Western intellectuals know what's best, right? They get there and there's this hilarious scene where like the Americans have a press conference, the French are all pissed, they're kind of fighting over the spotlight. One of the Americans, one of them lifts his fist in the air because he knew Europeans like to raise their fists in times of collective euphoria. Collective euphoria, right? Let's go back to Sabina when she talks about like the real evil is people like in a march. And it's kind of like this sheepish or like pleasure that comes from like, marching to demand whatever it is you're demanding. He says it doesn't really matter, it's that collective euphoria. Right? They arrive, and this is Franz, and he goes to kind of like honor the memory of Sabina, right? He goes, and there's the German poet, right? He's already written 930 songs for peace and against war. He set out as different from the crowd. I mean, and the author is very mocking, right? You're not different. You just have a beard and like, you've made yourself more of a visual icon, but you're still just part of this multitude, right? And then there's this point with the American like pop singer who runs up, right? Not and like this photographer's trying to capture it, right? As they're like saving these people from war, and the photographer blows up, and the singer and the actress are horrified and cannot budge as they're in this very like photographic like pose together, right? They timidly ventured, right? Then they were filled with a strange pride, right? Once more they joined the march. They're almost like, oh, okay, now we're really protesting against war. Like, look, the photographer got blown up. They go, and the response is very fitting, right? They go there and they make this grand spectacle. No answer. Nothing. Right? Nothing. It's like earlier in the park, right? When people were being shot by those silencers. Doesn't matter, right? I think of The Rock. It doesn't matter. Great American philosopher, The Rock. So it talks about, right, these kind of people that like to be looked at. Mentions Franz's son again, and because he desperately needed an imaginary eye to follow his life, he would occasionally write her long letters. That's really sad, right? He's kind of a tragic character. Speaking of tragic, or almost like what a shitty reason to go. Franz goes out, gets mugged, does like a judo chop, starts like fighting these guys, is having fun, gets like whacked over the head, wakes up in the hospital back in Geneva. Who does he see? Not Sabina, not the girl with the glasses, his like mistress, but his wife. And he looks at her with infinite hatred and trying to turn away, but he could not move his body. His head, perhaps? No, he could not move his head. He closed his eyes so as not to see her. That's from his perspective. Closes his eyes because he doesn't want to see this person. Yikes, right? What does she make of it though? And then you get during the ceremony, the mistress like is like so heartbroken, right? She has to be taken away. She's like the only one who like has an emotional like reaction. Is the one who's like not really permitted to like be there socially, right? And then yes, Marie Claude knew it for an absolute fact. Franz had constantly sought out death, right? Blah blah blah. He couldn't talk, but how he thanked her with his eyes. He'd fixed his eyes on her and begged her to be forgiven, and she forgave him. Right? Because that's her kind of telling himself and like, or like getting like okay with this narrative that she has created, right? He's saying he closes his eyes because he can't stand to look at her. To her, she's like, oh, he must be forgiving me. To be very careful, obviously, with what we interpret through the windows of the soul and others, maybe especially when they're comatose. But I mean, it's right. It reminds me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez quotes where he says he was too young to know that the heart's memory eliminates the bad and magnifies the good, and through that artifice we are able to endure the burden that we call the past, right? It's like we lie to ourselves to make life livable, basically. I'll find that exact quote, or I'll put it up when the time comes, right? So that's how those two humans end. And then we get to Karenin, right? And in the countryside and all that, right? Notice he's like the only happy one. He has this regular routine. Teresa had this like, obviously this notion of what the country village would be like, and then there's reality, right? So there's like dichotomy between the ideal and the real, and the kind of realization of, oh, I was a little off in how I idealized this in my head, to go back to Kish for a second. But let's talk about Karenin, right? He's this regular interval of time. Earlier in the book, they talked about his rights, him asserting his rights. And again, he might be the only happy one. And the language is used to like describe his life is like very like mythical, right? The author uses very intentional, like heavy language to be like, overwhelming joy of return or rebirth. He has this kind of like mythical language about him. And again, he is an animal. But then again, aren't we all an animal? And then boom, the preceding chapter, right? It gets into this treatment of animals, which is, morally complex, shall we say. One of those things that probably in 200 years, like I can't believe they I don't know, drive along Interstate 40 past Purdue Farms and all that, take a big whiff, tell me if it's wonderful, right? But hey, gotta get those $1.99 chicken fries or whatever, right? So anyway, our treatment of animals, is it right or wrong? And then there's this mention of Nietzsche, right? I think there's a couple reasons Nietzsche comes up. One, right, Nietzsche was all about your average human is a sheep, right? You are an animal, right? You're not a thinking being. You're not like an Ubermensch, right? You're kind of nothing, right? And also he had a break with reality, right? He had removed himself from the world of peoples when he like puts his arm around the horse. And if you're talking about happiness, is one of the ways to be happy to break with people. That might be the only one. He gets into this like longing for paradise, mocks it, gets into like questioning love, which a lot of people do, and it's a very cynical view of it, mocks it, right? But aren't these things inevitable? Aren't they part of the human condition? Let's see, right? And then finally, like, happiness is longing for repetition. That is why man cannot be happy, right? Teresa, like, she sees Tomas fixing the wheel of the truck that they're in, which, by the way, later will kill them. We don't see their death, which is interesting, right? And it's in that moment that she realizes, like, I've done it, right? He looks old. He looks weak. And she always wanted him to be weak, right? And is that what happiness is? Like, reducing your lover to the point where they're as weak as you are? I don't know, right? Do they achieve what they want? Their social importance has gone down. Their desirable spot to live is, no, they're not there, right? They're weak, yeah, right? So does happiness only happen if you break with reality, or if you diminish yourself to just being like, none of this matters, right? Franz in the air, Tomas in the end is like, haven't you noticed I'm happy, right? Again, is happiness possible? Is it only possible to break with mankind, go off into the countryside, and just accept true lightness that like literally nothing you do matters? Reminds me of Vonnegut in what is it? Here's his quote: "No country for no, not Man Without a Country." Right, where he talks about do authors give up? Right, and he says Twain gave up, and kind of does that with his last book, The Mysterious Stranger. I don't think Vonnegut ever gave up. He was more of a chin up kind of guy. Maybe he used humor to keep his chin up, but does Milan Kundera, does he give up? Right? Does he say that happiness is only? Right? And there's that kind of like chilling last scene where there's a hotel room, borrowed room, two beds like pushed together. Like really, they're two separate, but they're kind of shoved them together just to kind of pretend. After she's dancing again, you kind of get back to that image of dancing, which made him jealous back in the day. So I don't know. Is this a depressing book? I've always said no. This last time reading it through, one of my friends always says yes. I see that side way more now. I see that that one could certainly think this is depressing. So is your insignificance depressing? I mean, again, I think this is where I'll borrow the author's kind of thinking from it. It's what you make of it, right? It's a little bit liberating to realize, like, hey, I can do what I want. This is life. Like, I can make of it what I please. But right, other times it's terrifying, and people can't handle that, and then they invent ways to make life matter. So, is it depressing? It's what you make of it. Either way, fascinating book, beautifully done. I mean, just oozing with all kinds of eternal questions that, again, I hope I don't pretend like I have the answers to, but rather just it's good to explore these. All right, that would be it for now. That up ways.